Why do we value instant gratification over things that last? It's a simple question, yet it strikes directly at the heart of modern femininity and the way we navigate our lives today. We wake up in a world where convenience is worshipped, summoned through the next day delivery, no effort beauty routines, and apps that predict our needs before we've even registered them ourselves. In this frictionless existence, something essential has quietly slipped away: our ability to live with intention, and almost rebelliously vintage style has come back to confront that loss. Not as a charming trend or a Pinterest aesthetic, but as a whisper from another era asking, why did we stop doing things with care? It invites us to imagine a life where our daily routines feel like creation rather than chores, where applying eyeliner looks more like Audrey Hepburn's unhurried ritual in Breakfast at Tiffany's, or where getting dressed carries the ceremonial intimacy of Dita Von Teese lacing herself into a corset. It's a world where objects are chosen deliberately, not added to algorithmic carts, where clothes hold stories in their seams, echoing the structured elegance of the 1950s Dior New Look, the wild softness of 1970s bohemian dresses, or the resilience of 1940s wartime mending culture. This rising fascination with the past isn't nostalgia for nostalgia's sake, it's cultural resistance. Vintage style, whether seen in the grand millennial home movement, TikTok's old money revival, the bold glamour of the mob wife aesthetic, or the cottagecore obsession with 19th century domestic rituals, is more than a visual preference. It's a critique of the laziness culture we've internalized, a culture that tells us shortcuts are always superior, that effort is outdated, and that everything in life should be easy. Vintage asks something radical of us: time, attention, presence, and skill. And in doing so, it exposes how convenience culture demands less and less from us, until we eventually stop participating in our own lives altogether. In this video essay, we'll explore why vintage feels so much like a rebellion, how it pushes against everything digital culture attempts to normalize. We'll examine how convenience culture has reshaped femininity, attention, and creativity, and trace modern aesthetics back to their historical parallels, from Victorian domestic rituals to 1950s homemaker propaganda to the rise of fast fashion in the 90s. Ultimately, we'll uncover why choosing things that last isn't quaint or old-fashioned, it's quietly revolutionary. What if the past isn't holding us back, but showing us everything we've lost? Hello everyone, my name is Laura and welcome to my channel. Chapter 1. The Allure of the Deliberate. Vintage style is often dismissed as an aesthetic escapism, like the pastel palette of the marvelous Miss Maisel, the warm nostalgia of Call the Midwife, or the curated glamour and cigarette haze elegance of Mad Men. But beneath these charming visuals lies a deeper and more provocative truth. Vintage requires effort, the kind of deliberate care that modern convenience culture has conditioned us to believe is unnecessary, inefficient, or even outdated. Vintage style reminds us that there was a time when effort wasn't a burden, it was a value. In earlier decades, the rhythms of daily life were built around rituals of care. A 1950s dress, for example, wasn't simply slipped on. It was steamed after wear, mended with precision, stored carefully with the tissue paper, and sometimes even passed down through generations. Women didn't just apply makeup, they performed beauty rituals. Think of Marilyn Monroe lighting her bathroom mirror with candles to create a soft, diffused glow before applying her signature red lips. Or old Hollywood starlets like Rita Hayworth or Lauren Bacall, spending hours with cold cream hot roller, setting lotion, and pin curls. Beauty wasn't something to rush through in 10 minutes. It was crafted. Vintage style connects us back to the craftsmanship, a concept almost foreign in a world of mass production. Dior's New Look in 1947, with its cinched waist and full skirts, sparked a global revival of couture-level dressmaking after the rationing and utility clothing of World War II. The New Look wasn't fast fashion, it was architectural fashion, sculpted by hand, sewn with intention, and designed to honor the curves of a woman's body. Every seam, every stitch, every fold was deliberate. Contrast that with today's polyester microtrends, produced in hours and discarded in weeks, and the difference is almost painful. It also connects us to durability. Your grandmother's Pyrex dishes, the 1930s walnut dresser that still smells faintly of cedar, the 1960s rotary phone that weighs as much as a small dog. These objects weren't designed for seasonal replacement. They were engineered for decades of use. They were meant to age with you. There's a comforting solidity in vintage items, a sense of reliability that stands in stark contrast to the flimsy construction and the built-in self-destruction of modern products. When you hold a vintage item, you feel the weight, literal and metaphorically, of a different design philosophy. Vintage style is also rooted in slowness, a pace of living that feels almost radical today. Before fast fashion and the algorithmic churn of TikTok aesthetics, trends followed the rhythm of seasons. Women built wardrobes over years, adding 1 or 2 pieces at a time, saving up for the well-made coat, tailoring a dress to perfection, knitting a sweater by hand during the winter months. Clothing wasn't content, it was personal expression. It wasn't meant to be photographed once and discarded. It was meant to be lived in, loved, and repaired. And perhaps most poignantly, vintage style connects us to intimacy. Every vintage item carries a lineage. A typewriter once used for love letters, a 1920s ring passed from mother to daughter, a 1970s silk blouse worn to a first date, now slightly faded at the collar but richer for it. In a world where most objects arrive through impersonal cardboard boxes and algorithm-driven suggestions, vintage offers something more soulful. It offers history, it offers memory, it offers connection to lives lived before ours. This is why vintage isn't just a look. It's a lifestyle shaped by intention. It's a quiet form of resistance against the disposable ethos of modern consumerism. When you choose vintage today, you're choosing to step out of the algorithmic treadmill of micro-trends that appear and vanish within 48 hours. You're opting out of the homogenized aesthetic starter packs that social media tries to sell you. You're reclaiming your agency in a world that tries to curate your taste for you. And on TikTok, new trends die within days. Coastal cowgirl, tomato girl summer, vanilla girl, old money, quiet luxury. They exist for a lifespan of a scroll. But a vintage piece, a 1970s prairie dress, a 1960s pillbox hat, a 1950s full skirt, these don't expire. They don't expire because they were never created for novelty. They were created with care. They were created to last. And when you bring them into your life, they begin to tell a new story, your story, layered on top of the ones they already carry. Vintage style reminds us that we don't need a revolving closet of 100 Amazon dresses. We need 3 beautiful pieces that actually mean something. Pieces chosen with intention. Pieces that reflect who we are rather than what the algorithm says we should be. In a world obsessed with speed, ease, and endless replacement, vintage style quietly insists on something else entirely: deliberation, meaning, and memory. And that might be the most radical fashion statement of all. Chapter 2, The Rise of Instant Gratification. Welcome to the age of laziness culture. Not literal laziness, but the quiet, conditioned belief that everything in life should be effortless. Our society has embraced the vision once imagined by the Jetsons, where machines did everything while humans reclined in smooth plastic chairs and pressed a single button to summon a meal. Ironically, without ever intending to, we built that world. Today, we expect groceries to materialize at our doorstep, wardrobes to arrive curated in subscription boxes, makeup routines that promise no effort, and streaming platforms that automatically choose our next storyline for us. Convenience has seeped so deeply into everyday life that it has become almost invincible, subtly shaping our habits, reshaping our expectations, and rewriting our relationship to effort, time, and satisfaction. We use DoorDash dinner instead of cooking, convincing ourselves that chopping vegetables is an unnecessary burden. We buy Shein hauls instead of mending or thoughtfully choosing pieces grounded in quality. We let autoplay select our next show because making a decision after a long day feels like too much work. Algorithms curate our music, our moods, our reading lists, and even our sense of style. Filters replace facial expressions, templates replace creativity, and subscriptions replace taste. Shopping is no longer an act of choosing. It's an automated, algorithm-driven process where our carts are filled long before we know what we even want. Our attention spans have become the punchline of the digital age, shortened not only by TikTok's rapid-fire editing, but by the deeper systems designed specifically to eliminate friction. Netflix makes decisions for us. Spotify senses emotional shifts before we do, and apps pre-fill shopping carts with your recommended for you items. As cultural critic Kyle Sheikha warns, we have become passive participants in our own lives. more likely to scroll than to shape, more likely to accept than to choose, and slowly, effort itself has started to feel foreign. When a recipe has too many steps, we abandon it. When a website takes more than 3 seconds to load, we click away. When a hobby demands time or skill, we convince ourselves we're too busy to learn. When a trend requires craftsmanship, we buy the cheapest imitation possible. Yet historically, this mindset would have been unthinkable. Victorian women embroidered linens for months, crafting heirlooms stitch by stitch. In the 40s, wartime rationing pushed women to make do and mend movement, where old coats became skirts and stockings were patched with meticulous attention. The 1970s counterculture revived thrift sewing, quilting, and DIY customization as a political and aesthetic rejection of corporate mass production. And in the 90s, long before Pinterest and Instagram, teen girls expressed identity through low-tech rituals, decorating diaries with magazine clippings, refashioning denim jackets with patches and pins, burning CDs with carefully curated track lists for friends. These acts involved friction, and friction wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Friction created identity, it created memory, it created satisfaction, it pulled people into deeper engagement with their own lives. Today, convenience creates nothing. It offers no story, no texture, no memory, no craft. You don't remember the meal you ordered while doom scrolling or the $8 top you wore twice. You don't remember the playlist generated for you in 3 seconds or the Amazon decor you bought because it was close enough. This is the hidden cost of instant gratification. Convenience sells the illusion of freedom but demands something essential in return: quality, patience, skill, creativity, connection, and most dangerously of all, presence. The more convenience expands, the more participation shrinks. Tasks become things to avoid. Hobbies become too difficult, and experiences become too slow. When you remove friction from every part of life, you remove the opportunity for meaning. Convenience turns living into consuming, doing into skipping, choosing into accepting, feeling into numbing. You stop engaging, stop choosing, stop caring, and eventually stop feeling connected to yourself. Convenience creates a life that happens to you, not with you. And this is exactly why vintage feels like such a revelation. And such a rebellion. Vintage reintroduces friction. It brings back the need for effort, patience, and presence. It awakens the part of us convenient culture has lulled into sleep. Discernment, creativity, ritual, care, and tactile pleasure. Vintage makes you feel again and reconnects you to yourself. In a world optimized for speed, vintage dares to ask, what if meaning is found in the things we don't rush? Chapter 3, when aesthetic becomes a rebellion. Vintage style is not neutral. It may appear soft, wrapped in ribbons, ruffles, pearls, and patina, but beneath the charming visual lies something quietly subversive. Choosing vintage in the 21st century is an act of aesthetic rebellion, a refusal to let the pace of the digital culture determine how we dress, decorate, and define ourselves. In a world engineered for speed, sameness, and convenience, vintage becomes a declaration of intention. It resists the algorithm's pressure to conform and challenges the dominance of fast fashion cycles that turn individuality into mass-produced templates. To understand this rebellion, it helps to look at how modern aesthetics mimic the past in ways that reveal our cultural anxieties. Consider the mob wife aesthetic, with its big hair, fur coats, and unapologetic glamour. It's a direct echo of 1980s maximalism and Italian-American opulence, a flamboyant reaction to years of minimalism and clean girl restraint. Meanwhile, the clean girl look, slick bun, dewy skin, beige everything, draws from 1990s Calvin Klein minimalism, complete with hints of Gwyneth Paltrow's polished coolness in the movie Sliding Doors. It pretends to be effortless while requiring intense invisible labor. The coquette aesthetic, all pink bows, ballet flats, and soft curls, channels both Marie Antoinette's pastel decadence and the delicate looks of 1960s cinema like Jane Birkin and Brigitte Bardot. Cottagecore romanticizes pre-industrial womanhood, borrowing imagery from Jane Austen, Laura Ingalls Wilder, and 19th century domestic fantasies where life, despite its hardships, appears slow, tender, and rooted in nature. And dark academia, with its tweed blazers, leather-bound books, and dimly lit libraries, resurrects the intellectual romanticism of the early 20th century students. evoking Oxford, Dead Poets Society, T.S. Eliot, and Virginia Woolf. These aesthetics are not random trends. They are cultural responses, emotional reactions to the chaos, noise, and speed of modern life. When the world feels overwhelming, we retreat into images of eras that appear slower, more stable, and more meaningful. Vintage therefore becomes a grounding force, a counterweight to algorithmic acceleration. Choosing a vintage piece is choosing texture over digital smoothness, story over sterility, craftsmanship over convenience. It's choosing individuality in an era that rewards conformity. One of the most compelling aspects of vintage as rebellion is the joy of the hunt. Finding a 1970s DVF wrap dress in a thrift store or discovering a forgotten 1960s beaded clutch at an estate sale is not just a transaction. It's an experience. It feels like storytelling, archaeology, and accomplishment all rolled into one. Each item holds a fragment of history, and discovering it becomes a moment of connection between you and the person who once owned it. Unlike clicking add to cart, thrifting or antiquing requires patience, intuition, curiosity, and taste. It demands participation. The hunt transforms shopping into a narrative, where every find is a character and every object holds a plotline. This stands in stark contrast to modern shopping experiences designed to remove friction and reduce surprise. Algorithmic feeds deliver exactly what you want before you know what you want. Amazon's recommendation system makes sure nothing feels personal. Fast fashion produces replicas of yesterday's trends within hours. Nothing lingers, nothing asks anything of you, nothing feels particularly yours. Vintage, by contrast, values the beauty of imperfection. Modern decor trends love sterile perfection, white walls, minimalist furniture, symmetrical lines, and flawless finishes. Social media aesthetics push homes that look like digital renderings, smooth, spotless, and anonymous. Vintage rejects that sanitized uniformity. It embraces cracked spines of old books, worn edges of wooden dressers, faded fabric on a 1950s apron, tarnished brass hardware on a jewelry box, and the tiny carved irregularities in a handcrafted chair. These imperfections aren't flaws or characters. They tell stories. They reveal the passage of time. They remind us that objects were meant to be lived with, not just displayed. And in a deeper sense, vintage celebrates humanity itself. In a world increasingly mediated by screens and algorithms, where trends are optimized for clicks rather than lived experience, vintage insists on touch, texture, and connection. It insists that beauty doesn't have to be new to be meaningful. It insists that imperfection is not only acceptable, it's desirable. This is the rebellion, choosing something that asks more of you and gives more in return. Choosing something with soul in a world that rewards surface. Choosing a style that resists the flattening power of modern aesthetics, instead expands your sense of identity and place in the world. Vintage isn't just a fashion choice, it's an act of cultural defiance. A soft, beautiful way of saying no to disposability, no to sameness, and yes to stories, history, and individuality. Chapter 4, the broader societal echoes. The tension between deliberate slowness and instant gratification extends far beyond closets and aesthetics. It echoes through nearly every aspect of modern life. The more we look, the clearer it becomes that our hunger for speed has reshaped not only how we dress, but how we cook, travel, communicate, build homes, and even imagine our futures. And in each of these spaces, vintage values offer a kind of counter-narrative, a slower, richer alternative that challenges the emptiness of convenience culture. We see this most vividly in food culture, the resurgence of cottagecore baking, women lovingly kneading dough in sunlit kitchens, preserving fruit in mason jars, arranging bread on chipped porcelain, Mears 19th century domestic rituals found in the pages of Louisa May Alcott or Laura Ingalls Wilder. Today's sourdough craze echoes Depression-era cooking, when families relied on resourcefulness, time, and patience, rather than instant yeast packets or supermarket shortcuts. The popularity of vintage cookbooks, handwritten recipe cards, and farm-style kitchens reveals a longing for practices that ground us in sensory experience. Slow cooking stands in stark contrast to the fast food drive-thrus and Uber Eats deliveries that promise convenience but leave us disconnected from the nourishment process. Cooking used to be a ritual, a source of pleasure and pride. Now is a task many outsource, the revival of vintage-style cooking is less about aesthetic and more about reclaiming agency, taste, and time in a culture that constantly pressures us to rush. This longing for slowness extends into travel, where influencers curate quiet luxury European vacations that subtly recall the glamorous jet-set lifestyle of the 50s and 60s. In that era, travel was intentional, elegant, and often rare. Think of Grace Kelly disembarking from a plane in a tailored suit, or Jackie Kennedy touring Europe with timeless composure. Today's slow travel movement, a growing rebellion against the hyper-tourism of the 2010s, encourages people to spend weeks in a single city, explore local cafes, learn small habits of the neighborhood, and savor the experience rather than collect passport stamps. It's a pushback against the rush itineraries and chaotic content cycles, proof that we crave the depth, stillness, and romance that vintage travel once promised. The tension also emerges in our relationships. In an age of disappearing snaps, half-hearted likes, and dopamine-fueled scrolling, the act of writing handwritten letters feels almost radical. A letter requires time, patience, and vulnerability, qualities that have become scarce in digital communication. Analog forms of connection, like exchanging postcards, printing photos, or journaling, mirror earlier centuries where communication was deliberate, thoughtful, and often poetic. Even calling someone instead of texting echoes mid-century telephone culture, when conversations were events, not fleeting notifications. Vintage values reintroduce serenity in a world that often rewards speed over depth. The home is another landscape where the tension plays out. Trend cycles push people towards minimalist, neutral spaces filled with mass-produced furniture, sanitized decor, and identical aesthetic palettes shaped by Instagram. Meanwhile, vintage interiors full of mismatched china, crocheted blankets, and antique artwork, family heirlooms, and patinaed wood have surged back into fashion. Movements like grand millennial decor, cluttercore, and Regency-inspired interiors reveal a collective desire for homes that feel lived in, textured, and personal. Historically, homes were built over decades, filled with objects that held meaning, memory, and craftsmanship. Modern decor trends, in contrast, prioritize speed and photogenic appeal over emotional resonance. Vintage styles invites warmth back into the story. And then there's the environmental impact, perhaps the most significant societal echo of all. Vintage style is inherently sustainable. It keeps objects out of landfills, values repair over replacement, and embraces quality over quantity. Fast fashion, on the other hand, is a new industrial pollution, responsible for mountains of textile waste, microplastics in waterways, and exploitive global labor practices. Choosing vintage is not merely aesthetic, it's environmental activism wrapped in charm. It aligns with historical eras when people mended clothes, reused jars, and conserved resources out of necessity rather than trend. As the climate anxiety grows, vintage becomes not just a style, but a statement, a refusal to participate in the disposable culture damaging the planet. Ultimately, the broader societal echoes show that vintage values are not about romanticizing the past. They're about confronting what we've lost in a pursuit of convenience. They ask us to consider whether speed has made life easier or simply emptier. When modern comfort has come at the cost of creativity, connection, and care, vintage becomes a compass, pointing us back to a way of living that feels more human, more intentional, and more connection to the rhythm of times. Chapter 5. Reclaiming deliberation in a fast world. The beautiful truth about reclaiming deliberation is that you don't need to live in a period drama or transform your home into a curated museum of vintage treasures. You don't need to sew your own dresses, bake bread every morning, or exclusively drink tea from delicate china cups, unless you want to. The power of vintage values lies in not recreating the past, but in reintroducing intention into a modern world that constantly pushes us towards passivity. Even the smallest acts of slowness, those gentle, almost invisible moments that break our autopilot routines, can shift the emotional texture of an entire day. It begins with simple choices that ask you to participate in your own life rather than outsource it. Cooking one meal from scratch, for instance, becomes more than nourishment. It's a reconnection with a sensory experience. The smell of garlic warming a pan, the rhythm of chopping vegetables, the tactile joy of kneading dough. All of these are invitations back into your body. They echo a time when cooking wasn't a convenience but a domestic ritual, a grounding activity that defined the rhythms of the day. In a world of fast food and meal delivery apps, choosing to cook becomes a small act of rebellion against the rush. Writing a handwritten note offers another form of intentional presence. There's something deeply human about committing words to paper, something that digital communication, no matter how convenient, can't replicate. The slowness of handwriting forces clarity, tenderness, and sincerity. A handwritten letter is tangible, lasting. It requires care. For centuries, letters were love stories, lifelines, and emotional archives. Today, they feel almost radical in their intimacy. Mending something, whether it's a fallen button or a torn seam, reconnects us to the idea that objects and the lives connected to them deserve care rather than replacement. Historically, mending was an ordinary skill. Women during the 1940s, especially under rationing, became experts at extending the life of every garment they owned. Repair was not a hobby, it was a philosophy. In a consumer culture built on disposability, choosing to mend instead of toss becomes a quiet protest against waste and a reaffirmation of value. Curating instead of accumulating may be one of the most transformative shifts of all. Vintage living teaches us that we don't need countless items, we need meaningful ones. In a world overflowing with mass-produced decor and fast fashion hauls, curation becomes a practice of mindfulness. Choosing fewer, better things, a single well-made coat, a beloved piece of jewelry, a beautiful lamp with decades of history, brings intention back into our surroundings. It returns us to the idea that objects can be companions, not clutter. Doing one ritual slowly, whether it's brushing your hair, applying makeup, brewing tea, or setting a table, can feel almost ceremonial. Old Hollywood stars took hours preparing for an evening out, not because they were inefficient, but because beauty was an experience, not a sprint. A slow ritual creates space in every day. It anchors you, it invites calmness and pleasure into a schedule that's usually dictated by speed. Perhaps most importantly, making something that isn't content, something that never sees Instagram or TikTok, might be the most powerful act of resistance you can offer in a hyper-documented world. Draw something that no one will see. Bake something you don't photograph. Write something you don't post. Create for the sake of creating, the way people did for centuries before the internet turned every hobby into performance. Private creativity builds identity. It nourishes the inner world. It reminds you that not everything needs to be optimized for consumption. These small choices are tiny acts of rebellion against a system that would prefer you to be passive, predictable, and endlessly scrolling. They are reminders that meaning comes from participation, not automation. The beauty of reclaiming deliberation is that it doesn't demand a dramatic lifestyle overhaul. It asks only that you show up more fully to your own life. And in a world built on convenience, that might be the slowest and most radical act of all. So let me know in the comments below. I've always loved everything vintage and history. I just love the look of vintage fashion, vintage home decor, antique items, and everything was just way better built back then. Even if you look at a vintage blender from the 1960s, I feel like people would buy that then and it would last 50 years. Now everything is built to self-destruct, I find. Even older fashion from 20 years ago lasts longer. And it was just a different perspective back then. And I do love thrifting because I find it exciting going into stores and not knowing what you're gonna find and not knowing that everyone will have the same item. It's a thrill of the hunt. So anyways, and it's we forget about all these things and just being intentional with our purchases and how we live our lives. So let me know in the comments below your thoughts on vintage and kind of that whole lifestyle around it. All right, thanks for watching.